we're talking about gestures, right?
Save it for after we mess up the introduction. I am in that kind of mood tonight.
There's a little bit of humming right there, but that was probably Alex. He's the hummingbird.
Oh my god, I just set that up right.
Because anytime someone says they want to become an interpreter, people gather around and go, what is going on in your head? Because no one has a clue what goes on in interpreters' heads.
But that's science. That's how it is everywhere, and even if people have exactly the same background.
When you have a PhD in interpreting, almost whatever question someone asks you about interpreting, your answer is, I have no idea. How am I supposed to know? All I did was a PhD in that subject. I thought, wow.
Off we go.
Here we go.
Welcome to the Troublesome Terps, the podcast about things that keep interpreters up at night, excluding crying children, roadworks outside your bedroom window, and a dodgy takeaway the night before. Believe it or not, this is episode 24, and it is my pleasure to welcome back my co-hosts and co-equal troublemakers. First off, he's apparently inimitable, indomitable, unshaven, and exceedingly knowledgeable. It's Alexander Drexel. Alex, welcome.
Thank you, Alex, and hi, everyone. Just to let people know what's going on there. So this quote, the inimitable and so on, comes from Kevin Quirk, who's currently the president of FIT. So I don't know if he's listening to the show. I surely hope so. So quick shout out to Kevin, and thanks for providing me with a nice Twitter bio.
I'm more interested in his German cheese-making brother, Kevin Quark.
Oh, stop it.
That was... No. That's his brother who's into ducks, which is Kevin Quack.
Yeah.
Oh my god, I just set that up right. Oh god. All right. And as you can, of course, tell, we have with us the Prince of Pithy Puns, our very own Jonathan Downey. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Earlier today, I thought I would not make it because I had a really bad broadband error, which is English for, oh my goodness, nothing is working.
Well, thank God it's working now.
You know, I'm just thinking it felt like I was losing contact with the outside world. It's a perfect rehearsal for Brexit.
Oh,
the B word.
So we've got the Brexit shout out down. Now all we need to do is mention GDPR in context and we're good for the show.
I was just going to say GDPR is missing, but we'll get there.
It's okay. We can't mention GDPR because we're not allowed to talk about GDPR.
Yeah.
Because that'd be breaching GDPR.
Probably, but we can always send out consent forms. But let's talk about that later. Now,
nice.
It's like going back to school.
Well, with all of that out of the way, once again, we have a fabulous guest on our show. She is a lecturer and research associate in applied linguistics at Zurich University of Applied Sciences. Please welcome to our show, Caroline Lehr. Caroline, welcome.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you.
Nice to be with you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, we're actually we're quite honored to have you because you're a bit of a radio celebrity now. Because you were on the famous German broadcaster Deutschlandfunk a couple of weeks ago talking about machine translation, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. Yeah, talking to experts on artificial intelligence and trying to explain them why we need humans when we translate and when we interpret. Yeah, exactly. That was my job, and I was very honored to be able to represent the community.
And you did a good job, if I may say so.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
It's also a very good topic because it was the very first topic that we had on the show in episode 1, way back when. And just the other day, Jonathan, we had a nice online discussion going on Twitter, right, about machine versus human, or maybe machine with human.
Well, see, this is the thing, because I was at the CUT conference, and on a very learned, excellent panel, we had my former senior PhD supervisor, Professor Graham Turner. So it was a real challenge for me that Graham said that he reckoned that they were training perhaps the last generation of interpreters. And after that, of course, I live tweeted that. And there was a really nice discussion on Twitter. And I've actually realized that the answer to why we need human interpreters is that if there weren't any human interpreters, the coffee would not get drunk.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very important.
Yeah. Yeah. Another another thing that's that I also that I mentioned already, and which is part of my research is emotions. Humans have emotions. Human interpreters have emotions, and emotions are very important in the message and in communication. And so far, we can hardly imagine how machines should ever be able to transfer emotions and to communicate them properly.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I just wanted to mention real quickly how we came across you, Caroline. I think the first time we met, fittingly, was at a CUT conference, or the CUT forum, as it used to
I
be
think
called.
so. Yes.
Yeah, I think that was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it was always in Geneva, and I think this year they're starting a new format. So this time it was in Edinburgh. But
And so we didn't meet.
so we didn't meet, which is a shame. But at least we get to meet online tonight, which is good as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, before we jump into the topic, can you give our listeners a little idea of how you've been coming into the profession of interpreting and how you became a researcher a bit later on?
So yeah, actually, that may be very disappointing. I'm not a trained interpreter. I studied in Geneva, where we used to meet, but I studied translation, and that's how I started off. And then when writing my master thesis, I became quite interested in the brain and in cognition and in the processes that are going on in the bilingual brain. And so after finishing my translation degree, what I did was I started a PhD, and an interdisciplinary PhD with a psychologist, working on how emotion influences translation processes. And then did my whole doctoral training in psychology, and then did my postdoc once I had written my dissertation many years later when I started my postdoc. Did my postdoc in London at UCL, and then did my postdoc in a psychology department in a research group with psychologists working on language, being interested in language. But I continued to work on translation and then also interpreting processes, which are very different, but for research purposes have certain things in common. So the last 2 years now, in Zurich, I've started my new job in Zurich in February, and before the 2 years before, what I did was I tried to explain to psychologists and neuroscientists how interesting interpreting processes are and why they are a very interesting research topic. Yeah.
Wow, so it sounds like the emotional side of interpreting, to put it that way, has been on your mind for quite a while then.
For quite a while, oh yeah, in a very intense way, and I thought about it, a lot, and from many different perspectives, and we also started a study with interpreters, which is still running, to examine how emotions influence performance in the booth. Yeah.
That's really interesting for me because, I finished my PhD 2 years ago, and the impression that I was given at a lot of conferences was that a lot of people in the cognitive side of interpreting research preferred data sets without emotion and without necessarily things that would trigger anything but language comprehension and cognition.
Exactly, yeah.
And so it's good to see, because especially with you talking about emotion in the booth, that's a very different way of talking about cognition research than most people are used to, because most cognition research is in some kind of simulated environment that they try to keep clean from, they would tend not to use emotional content. They tend to prefer technical content, because then you can trace numbers and terminology and things. What reaction have you had from the people in the rest of the cognition side of interpreting to this idea of deliberately studying the way that emotion affects our thinking in the booth?
Thank you for that comment. You're absolutely right. That's how cognitive science and brain research actually began, right, by seeing the human brain as a computer, comparing it to a computer, a rational information processing device. And the person I did my PhD with, Klaus Scherer, who was a professor of psychology at the University of Geneva, was one of the persons in psychology who said, look, that's not the way human beings work. What really, one of the things that makes us humans is that we have emotions. But that was a long battle to convince people to start studying emotions, and he was one of them. I'm very proud to have worked with him, but it took a long time to raise this awareness, and also to make it acceptable among professionals. Say, yes, emotions are part of performance. For a long time, emotions were something that were considered to be actually non-professional. So you were right. It was a long battle. Once I began my research, I was rather welcomed with this topic, and many people finally saying, "Oh, finally, someone works on emotions, and someone does it." But for other researchers, it took a long time to get accepted with this topic, and to also to find the methodological means to actually study emotions. Yeah.
Well, that is a challenge, because I'm thinking of cognitive researchers like Killian Sieber. And I recently asked him a question because I realized that there's a big gap between what we know of interpreter cognition and what we know of interpreter sociology. You have Anthony Pym talking about the contextualists versus the cognitivists. And I asked him about, has there been any research on interpreter decision making in context? And his email was basically like, well, we don't have a method. And it seems like if you're studying emotion, that's another step towards understanding how the results that we've found in the laboratory might actually apply to real life, where there's always going to be some kind of emotion, whether it's boredom, sadness, anger at the speaker talking for 15 minutes and saying nothing. There's always some kind of emotion going on.
Yeah. We always have some kind of emotion. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Some kind of, maybe not some kind of emotion, but some kind of feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, even if it's just, I'm dying for another piece of chocolate.
But sorry, if I can just jump in right there, because you just made a difference there, Caroline, between feeling and emotion. Maybe, can you just explain that for a second, what the difference is?
So yeah, in research, an emotion is actually an episode, something that is triggered by a stimulus, and that is quite intense. So an emotion starts with a cognitive evaluation of a situation, of a stimulus, which can be an object, it can be a person, it can be a reaction from someone, and we evaluate what we perceive, and the way we evaluate it then leads to the emotion, and that's very subjective, so that people who see the same have different emotions because they evaluate them, and they evaluate what they see in a different way, and this triggers the emotion, and then the emotion consists of different, in research, as this is very complex, we have tried to divide it into components. We have a physiological reaction, something like sweating or feel our heart beating. Then we may have a motor expression. For example, we may smile, or we adapt our posture when we're proud. You may see that, and we may have action tendencies. A very survival-related one, which comes from evolution. That's how emotions have developed through the evolution of the human race. Is fleeing when we are afraid. That was relevant when we had to do with lions.
The whole fight
that is less relevant today, but it's still there. It's still there that we're trying to avoid things that have a negative impact on us. And then also emotions influence, and that's probably most interesting for performance in professional life today. Emotions influence the way we process and can influence the way we process information, and they can help us to process information, or they can make it more difficult. And just to finish this idea of the emotion, all these different components then give rise actually to what we then perceive as the subjective component, as the feeling, right? This consists of all of those different things going on in our brain and also going on in our body. Yeah. That's the definition of emotion, and it took a long time to find it. But of course, feelings, we may not always be able to say we have a particular emotion, but we can always say, do we feel better or less good? So positive, negative is something we can always say. But usually emotions, how we imagine emotions, is that those ones are particular episodes, quite intense ones, triggered by something. Yeah.
That begs a question. It's a purely research question, but I'd imagine some emotions, if you want to research them, your ethical approvals must be pretty tricky. I was thinking of a time when I was interpreting in a volunteer capacity, and they were talking about a people group where their only economic activity was selling their mothers, wives, and daughters into prostitution. And I think anyone who thinks you can interpret that sort of thing and not feel an emotion has obviously never interpreted. But if you wanted to recreate that in the lab, I'd imagine your ethics board would have some very serious questions to ask you, because you're then exposing someone to a very negative stimulus that could have a long-term effect on them.
Of course, there are different arguments. One thing is that you, in the lab, maybe, or in a study, you try to induce only mild emotions, or as we did with the conference interpreters, we compared positive emotions to a neutral group, so that there would not be any negative effects. Another argument, of course, could be to induce negative emotions. As you said, these emotions are actually occurring. That's part of your life. That's part of your profession. So why should you not be able to recreate at least some parts of it? But you're absolutely right. There's a very important ethical dimension, and to study really intense negative emotions, I think the only thing you can do is probably to do case studies. If you have an interpreting, or if you have the recording of an interpreting that has already been done, like the one you have just described and mentioned, you may be able to analyze it because it has happened, but you may not be able to do actually an experimental study with this intensity. Yeah, obviously, ethical aspects are very important. And maybe coming back to what you said before, the methods are difficult, but one of the jobs of researchers is to constantly develop methods. And one thing, for example, that will be very interesting for the future, and that is already being used, is virtual reality, where we can recreate a whole virtual reality. And that may open up new possibilities also for studying interpreting.
So, meaning that you would use virtual reality, like a virtual reality goggles, for example, to create a situation, and then put people into the situation and observe how they react to it or how they navigate the situation?
For example, yeah, that would be the concept that is already being done as well. Now I've also heard that psychologists are using it to train people to get more used to speaking in public. So I think that remains to be explored. I think how we can use this. Yeah, maybe also in training. Yeah.
So one thought that occurred to me earlier, maybe it's a bit late for this the discussion, but because you said you worked with researchers from other disciplines, for example, from psychology, from psychology, was that because that, at least when I wrote my final thesis, there was still this sort of idea in the room that interpreting studies is not really research, so that it's not really a discipline on its own, or that it's more of a mixture of various disciplines, or I think that the euphemism would be that it's multidisciplinary. Was that ever an issue when you worked with those other, with psychologists, for example, or did they, well, I guess for lack of a better word, did they accept you as a real researcher, if you know what I mean?
So yeah, of course. Why why did it lack acceptance? Because it started as a professional discipline, right? And the questions that people had were linked to practice, and most of these people in the beginning were not trained researchers. And of course, the idea was to work with those people who are specialists in research, in studying the brain, and studying cognition, and studying psychological processes.
Yeah.
To get their expertise, because they are doing nothing else. They are doing only that. And we are also professionals. So we need, when we want to do research on interpreting, and translation is the same, we need a little bit of expertise in both, right? We need an access to both worlds. And yeah, absolutely. My idea was to work with those people, to also, because we were talking about methodology, to benefit from their methodological knowledge, because they have it. And also to make our discipline as a research discipline, to make it, to improve its acceptance by showing that we can do research that perfectly fits the requirements that other larger, also older disciplines have. Mm-hmm. And I also think that it has also benefits for the discipline being a study of an object of scientific study, because it increases awareness of how complex these processes are. Mm-hmm. And you can show it scientifically, you can show it with data, and people see what a complex process it is, how interesting it is. And that was indeed a process. I started with talking to the psychologists. I started with getting recommendations like, and then you can maybe replace some words, because that's what it is all about, right? We replace some words, and that's how we translate or interpret. And when I finally defended my thesis, the situation was really different. And the psychologists, I had learned a lot from them, and I think they had also understood much better what mediation between languages is about, and how complex it is. Yeah,
that sounds great. Yeah,
I mean, it does take me back a bit. It's always nice. It's not always nice being around another interpreting studies scholar, but it takes me back a bit, because when interpreting studies first began, kind of in the 60s and 70s, my understanding was that there was a little bit of reticence from the profession at seeing all these psychologists come in and wanting to basically wire us up to things and see what happened. It seems like the opposite has come now, where there's a realization that for interpreting to continue to thrive, and for us to be able to teach a new generation of interpreters, we need to understand what's going on in interpreting as well. And I've been really pleased. On the one hand, I've been really pleased to see the acceptance of other disciplines in interpreting studies, and even amongst professionals. On the other hand, it's still slightly annoys me a little bit that we don't really have any such thing as interpreting theory. We borrow from wherever we can find something, which means that you can get amazing results, and then you can get the occasion, like I had one of my colleagues who tried to read one of the modern papers on interpreter cognition, and she was smart. She was doing a PhD as well. And she said, I speak 2 languages, but obviously not the one that, I speak 4 languages, but obviously not the one that paper was written in. And it was a paper on interpreter cognition written in English.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I get it.
And the problem was that it was too, not really relevant to interpreting.
Well, it was published in the top journal of interpreting, and the problem was that I think the person writing it assumed that everyone reading it would have an equal background in cognitive science as he did. And if you don't understand, that actually sometimes you're talking about the same things but using different words, then you can get lost very, very quickly. So there's a really basic example. Sometimes you have to sit down and explain to people that when the cognitive scientists talk about EVS, they're talking about what most interpreters would call lag. And that's that's just a very simple example. But some interpreters, if you say, ear, voice, span, or EVS, they go,
Oh, you mean décalage?
Yeah, do you mean décalage? Are you going to measure my head? Those kind of things. That's a really simple example, which shouldn't be very common now. But there is an issue with interpreting studies. You could have two people in the same field studying sometimes very similar things and just not understanding each other because they come from different backgrounds.
But that's science.
Yeah.
That's how it is.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And even if people are studying have exactly the same backgrounds,
Yeah.
they may give different labels to the same thing. That is indeed one. It's a general problem in science to find the right concepts, the right labels. But also, especially when you work when the work is interdisciplinary, then you always have to renegotiate the vocabulary. And to explain sometimes what you mean, and indeed what I think what you're saying is very pertinent. That sometimes when we describe the brain, which is not easy, right? Sometimes things may get very abstract, and in the end you're like, okay, but what does he actually mean by that? That I think that's just everyday business in science, and that's what we also have to do to always redefine and sometimes also conceptualize things in a way that is very abstract, but because then we can then we have something we can then define maybe in more detail, or we can work with as long as we don't know it better, right? I understand what you mean. I read many scientific papers, and I had to read them more than once. So yeah.
Part of me would long to see, in fact, a lot of me would love to see a uniting of the tribes. I'm a bit of a dyed-in-the-wool contextualist because I did my PhD in field research.
Yeah.
But then there's an understanding that even if you understand everything that's going on in the context, that doesn't fully explain what the interpreter's doing, and vice versa. You could understand the interpreter's cognition perfectly, and there could be some contextual trigger that you just haven't accounted for.
Of course,
and it's a lovely open problem that if anyone can join the cognitivists and the contextualists, they'd probably win some kind of prize.
Well, I think that's probably the next step, to bring those things together and try to create a bigger picture. But of course, that's not how you can start. Interpreting is quite a young discipline. It's not very old.
It is, yeah.
And then you have to focus on particular aspects. And the more research there is, the more we can bring them together and build a more, as you say, a more complete picture of it. But I think that may take a bit of time because it is, compared to other disciplines, it's very young.
This is the thing. When you have a PhD in interpreting, almost whatever question someone asks you about interpreting, your answer is, I have no idea.
Or it depends.
Yeah.
Someone mentioned something on Twitter, which was actually basically my PhD question, and my answer was, how am I supposed to know? All I did was a PhD in that subject.
Of course, the more you dive into the subject, the more you realize how complex it is and how little you actually know.
Yeah, and the less certainty you have.
Yeah, so I started my PhD with the theory and lots of clues. I ended it with very little theory and definitely no clue whatsoever.
Yeah,
that's normal, I think. Yeah.
But I mean, given all these, I guess, challenges or restraints, I mean, you told us that you were very interested in the topic. How did you then actually go about sort of studying it or researching it? Because it seems to me that it's a bit of an abstract topic, I think.
Emotions,
as you said already. So how did you approach it? Emotions and the role they play in interpreting.
It took me a long time to really find my hypothesis and to find something that both the at the time the translators, or now and the postdoc, me and what I thought would be relevant to the interpreters and the psychologists made both sides happy. That is a challenge indeed. So how do you go about studying emotions? Well, in the end, it's actually quite easy. You have this idea of what an emotion is, and then you start manipulating emotions. You try to induce emotions.
It sounds very
in
evil
people.
when you put it like that.
It can be.
Okay.
But it can be, definitely. But in this case with the interpreters, it was actually, I think, quite nice, because they listened to music and they saw nice pictures, and yeah, we did not go. It was not more than that. But yeah, so you start manipulating emotions, and then you try to assess what happens, how people react, and how they perform. And in this case, what the hypothesis that is behind my research was behind my PhD research, and is also partly now behind this study with the interpreters, is that positive emotions increase creativity and fluency, verbal fluency, and positive emotions help you to process abstract concepts.
Oh, okay.
I need to eat a lot of chocolate the next time I interpret for an accountant then.
Yeah, I think so.
But I mean, when you say you manipulate emotions, as I said, it sounds a bit evil. I was just joking, but I mean, what does it mean in the concrete? I mean, what does it look like? Just for me to be able to imagine it.
Yeah, what does it look like? So, so one thing can be music and pictures. So people get audio input and visual input that has been pilot tested. So in this case, it was Mozart, and pictures of things that remind you of holidays and other nice things. But manipulating emotions in other contexts, in experimental contexts, can also be that people do a task and they get a feedback on that task. And this feedback is totally random. So it's either positive or it's negative, independent of the performance you actually had on that task. That could be another manipulation. Music is used quite a lot. Music is quite a strong, it's quite a powerful stimulus, emotional stimulus. I think everyone probably can confirm this intuitively. Which is...
It's too bad we can't listen to music in the booth.
Yeah.
It would help sometimes.
Maybe.
But I actually do have a colleague who listens to classical music right before, like you cannot talk to him before the interpretation, because he says he needs the classical. Really? I don't know. It kind of gets him into the right mood, I guess. So, yeah.
See, this is the other thing. When I have a conference that I'm feeling particularly nervous about, as a Christian, I will spend 10, 15 minutes praying in tongues before it.
In tongues?
Yeah, literally. So I'll pray in tongues before it, and I find that for me helps get me into the mood and into the place. And I was just thinking, when you're talking about manipulating emotions, I thought that's called being a parent.
Or being a child.
It's interesting because your work reminds me, when I was writing my first book, I wrote a section on the importance of humour. And I found a study where they gave people this really strange puzzle to do. I think I'll put it in the show notes. And they found that the only people who succeeded in completing this rather random puzzle about, how do you attach a candle to a cork board or something, the only people who completed it were the people who'd watched slapstick comedy beforehand.
Right.
Yeah, but that's exactly it.
And it does seem like there's some kind of... So, like, before I write the book, sometimes I will go and write something really stupid or write some silly jokes or read some one-liners, because I find there are certain things that automatically bring me into a creative place. I will have something funny going on, have some music on, and have a cup of tea on the table. And my brain, as soon as it sees those stimuli, goes, and now it's time to write.
Yeah, and I'm sure for British people, the effect of humor is magnified. Well. It's even more important for the Brits. It's even a better effect.
If you lived with this weather, you would need a good sense of humor too.
But I enjoyed it a lot when I lived in Britain, and missed it sometimes.
You didn't live in Scotland; you lived in London.
I lived in London.
I apologise profusely for that experience. But London's motto should be the city that you go to when you're trying to go somewhere else.
That was exactly my case. Yeah.
So, people say to me, how much have you seen, I've lived in the UK almost all of my life, and they say, how much of London have you seen? And I say, Gatwick, Heathrow, King's Cross, Euston, and for some reason, every time I cross the road in London, I end up changing at Green Park Tube Station. It's really strange. It's the only city where you cannot cross the road without changing the tube.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I've seen a lot more, and but it's true. It was a kind of it was a very it was a wonderful period of my life, but it was a transitional period indeed. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
The amazing thing about researchers is, as soon as you ask it, there was a joke in our department that the first thing that interpreting researchers ever learned about interpreting was interpreters aren't quite normal. And then, when you get to higher levels, you realize that clients aren't normal either. And it's how much of, because we had this question we were doing our PhDs, is how much did you find that the existing theory of, cognition and how the brain worked, how much did that apply easily to interpreting? And how much did you go, well, we're going to need to change this a little bit?
I think actually interpreting, it's a very important object of study, because what is happening now, what you've mentioned before, these studies in the lab do not represent reality, right? And this is how we had to start. We had to control most of the things to be able to build knowledge on the brain. But now what is happening is that psychologists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists are realizing this is really, really very far from reality. Most of the participants in the studies are students. The entire environment, when we examine the processing of language, that has not much to do with actual communication. We don't communicate in words, we communicate in sentences, in discourse. So interpreting, and that's also what we saw in the study, gives us a good example of realistic and very complex language processing in the brain, which is performed by experts. You're experts in what you're doing, and you have built up automated processes, you have a certain routine, you can cope with the stress, or mostly. It's really a challenge to all those theories. And as you say, they only partly apply to those tasks which are real tasks. And one of the things that I did, and one of the things that the psychologists were interested in, is to see, do these theories that we have from the lab actually apply to this task, to this realistic language task, and to those professionals. And it seems they only partly do. And that, of course, means that we have to revise certain things. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Can I ask you the horrible question that the contextualists always ask the cognitivists? How realistic do you think controlled experiments on interpreting can be, given that we know so much about the unpredictability of interpreting context? I know some people like Cynthia Roy, Cecilia Vadenshaw have argued that the interpreting context is changing with each utterance. How realistic can your controlled experiments be, given what we know about interpreting changing in context?
So what we did now, we work with interpreters in the booth. They were doing this study in their lunch break. They were so kind to sacrifice their lunch break for this study. So what you can do is to make it as realistic as possible. Of course, as soon as people know that they are in a study, and this is what you have to inform them about, the fact that they are studied, as soon as this happens, something changes. But that's one of the things that science has to cope with. So this is, of course, a question that always occurs. How realistic is it? Is it really? Does it really represent a realistic context? And I think it partly does, and partly it doesn't. But I think that's how it is, and we can try to make it as realistic as we think we can. Also, we also have to cope with certain constraints. I mean, these people were giving me 30 minutes twice, And I was very grateful for that. But of course, I would love to have them for 3 hours. I could do plenty of things, but they don't have the time, and I can very well understand that. So you have to cope with a lot of constraints that always are also constraints to this thing being totally realistic. But we have to do our best. As we always have to, and being aware of these limitations. I think we always have to mention them.
But I suppose one of the limitations is also that the students are not experienced interpreters, I would say. Do you bear that in mind?
So those were now real interpreters, experienced interpreters. Were very, very kind to let us in and let me in and let me into their world. So that was great. Yeah.
So, I mean, as far as I'm aware, the days of using students for cognitive interpreting work are basically finished, apart from one or two deliberate examples like Elisabeth Theselius' work on expertise. When you're doing a cross-sectional comparison, you need them. It's interesting because I know in my thesis, in the appendices, because there was an incident that I didn't manage to get time to analyze in my thesis, there was a really interesting incident that I was interviewing people about that happened before I got there. And it was talking about interpreters dealing with the emotion of embarrassment and shock. And it's interesting because within some of the field work that's been done in interpreting, although it's not kind of the variables aren't controlled, there are quite a lot of case studies. I know Andrew Clifford has a wonderful case studies of interpreters dealing with emotion in medical interpreting. And the fact that we have these case studies from field work and we have these case studies from experiments makes me wonder whether there's work to be done to look at the commonalities between the two. I would imagine that there would be more in common than there would be different. But a good theorist would be more interested in the differences and the commonalities, I think.
Yeah, of course. One data collection is always one, part in the one piece in the puzzle, and yeah, of course, one object of studied through different methods and different approaches. That's what we have to aim for, so that we have different perspectives on it, and hopefully, as you say, evidence may be a little, at least to a certain extent, be converging, and then we can draw some conclusions, or our conclusions become then even more substantial when we can draw on other studies that have worked with different methodologies. That's definitely what we should aim for, and that's why we still need more studies on interpreting.
Maybe talking about I hope it's a related topic. I have no idea how interpreting research works, so bear with me. I think a lot of interpreters are very intrigued by the concept of flow, because I was reminded of that when you talked earlier about sort of how being in a good positive state, emotional state, can help you with your performance.
Yeah.
Have you come across that? Does that play a role at all in your research? Because it's also so elusive, some people talk about it, that they've experienced it, and then other people think, oh, this must be great, but I've never had it in the booth.
Yeah, I must say I have come across it in my psychology classes, and I have always wondered if I have ever experienced
because
it.
It's not clear, right? I mean, yeah,
and I don't know if I ever have.
Exactly the same about that.
It's a very interesting concept, and remains to be studied probably in interpreting. Or we must find people who have who are aware of having experienced it. But the concept itself, the flow experience, there are some similarities with the theory that is behind my research. That positive emotions increase your cognitive fluency. Thinking is faster, it's easier. You can retrieve information easier. You can think more creatively. That's one approach to positive emotions. That this one idea of positive emotions that they can have this effect. Then, of course, emotional experience are very complex. And there's also another thing that's another concept that is very relevant for performance, which is motivation. and our feeling, the mood, if it is positive or negative, is also influenced by our motivational state. So positive emotions, if they are very intense, can also have a demotivating factor, because we are very satisfied with how things are, and we're happy with our performance, and we kind of actually invest less effort, because it signals to us that everything is fine, that we don't have to invest more effort. So whereas negative emotions can have a slightly motivating effect, when we believe we're not there yet, but we can make it, then we will invest a lot of effort to actually reach this goal. So then, yeah, it's very emotions are very complex.
That's a good way of wrapping it up. Yeah.
And what we can do at the moment with the methods that we have, with the stage of research that we are in, is to shed one particular light on this complexity, and say, okay, we're going to investigate this aspect, and then we're going to see what we find, and maybe we have to rethink certain things. For example, in interpreting, one important thing that this theory on positive emotions has never taken into consideration, or not much, is cognitive load.
Oh yeah.
How does cognitive load, which is very relevant in interpreting, actually influence emotions? And this is why it is important to work with professionals, because cognitive load, there you come across cognitive load, and in this particular task especially. So interpreting research raises new questions, or studying interpreting raises new questions, also with respect to psychological theories. Yeah.
And I think this is the thing, is that there used to be a myth around interpreting that if speakers would just slow down, it would make our job easier.
Oh, no,
yeah, exactly. Quite the opposite.
Sometimes.
So I know that psychologists were struggling so there was a couple of psychological myths that went around in interpreting. There was one myth that began that said, the brain is basically a single channel processor, which turned out not to be true, because interpreting is actually possible. And then there was this myth that high speed would be a real issue because there would be too much information. And as far as I'm aware now, the state of play seems to be that we've found out that interpreters are very good at summarizing. And so a fast speaker you can deal with, but then I had a speaker who technically was giving me very low cognitive load because he was speaking even slower than I am speaking now. And the problem with that, it sounds like low cognitive load, because how much information is your brain having to store, but in reality it's high cognitive load, because you're going, okay, I'm having to make him sound more interesting than he actually sounds, because I'm an interpreter. But on the other hand, I can't jump ahead of him because I don't think even he knows where he's going next. Oh, and to make it funnier, his entire thing, he was doing the metaphor of a train going very quickly along the tracks. And part of me was like, that's not a high-speed train. That's an old, nearly dying diesel that you've got there, mate. And it's the, even quantifying something like cognitive load in interpreting is not the easiest. And understanding what even if someone said what makes interpreting more difficult, we could throw them some answers, but very few of them have been positively proven.
Yeah, and then you could get into the whole thing of, being challenged in a good way, being challenged in a bad way, and the whole sort of matrix between how good you are and how challenging the assignment is, and all of that, which is highly interesting, but probably completely too much for this one, for this one episode. Yeah. Now, what I'm wondering is, although maybe you haven't answered all the questions that you've set out to answer in your research, Caroline, I'm wondering if it's possible to leverage what you have learned so far to use it in everyday practice. So is it possible to kind of influence one's own emotional state to improve performance, for example? Or is that a bit too much to ask?
No, that's, I think, what we're trying to do every day to influence our emotional state, and we should try to do it. I think one thing in general, without having all the analysis ready, is that emotional competences, or maybe some people know it under the concept of emotional intelligence, is something very important. And in the last years, more and more people become more and more aware of that, and studies show that it is a very important factor in your life satisfaction, but also in professional satisfaction and success. So what is emotional competence? In general, emotional competence is actually the way you're able to deal with your emotions. And as we know that emotions influence the way we perform, the way we interact, the way influences our relationships, these competences are very relevant. So especially one competence is to regulate, being able to regulate emotions. And I'm sure you're actually very good at that. Otherwise, you probably would not be able to do this job. And stress is, of course, one emotional phenomena that you, I think, have to be able to regulate well in your job, and you have to adjust to having techniques to regulate these emotions and being able to perform under stress. So these are, of course, also techniques that you can train and that you may even refine, or that you may bring more to consciousness to improve them. That's one thing. Then in communication, emotional competences are very important. Being able to recognize emotions, not only verbally, but also non-verbally, right?
So
and that's also
empathy or
empathy. Empathy probably is the consequence of recognizing emotions. The first thing I would think of is the pure process of recognizing them through the face, through the voice, through gesture, through posture, being able to interpret an emotion that is communicated, and also being able to interpret, is this intentional or is it not? Which also influences the decision, is this something that actually will influence what I interpret? That is part of emotional competences as well. Then that may, expressing emotions, of course, that is another emotional competence, being able to express emotions. When we think of interpreting, being able to express them cross-culturally, right? There are differences, there may be differences, and also differences in the norms that we have in expressing emotions. Then when you think of maybe dealing with clients, it can also be important to express emotions in a very constructive way. But these things are relevant in professional life as they are also in private life. And these competences, I think what we can say in general is that we should attach importance to these competences in training, as well as in the profession and on an individual level. Yeah.
And I think one more dimension, I think, that comes to this, should we call it emotional skills? Maybe it's not, because you mentioned the speaker base, basically, where we have an emotional relationship when we work, when we interpret someone. You talked about the client as well, but I would probably also add boothmates.
Yeah,
which can, I think we've covered this in earlier episodes, that can be an emotional challenge as well, dealing with boothmates, both in a good and in a bad way, I guess.
Yeah. Of course.
I think also the really interesting thing from your subject and the way that you've described it is that there was a concern for a long time in some areas of interpreting research that the problem with the cognitive research was it was precisely treating interpreters like computers, and we call it the conduit model, where it's just language in, language out. It's really interesting with you talking about the importance of these emotional competencies and being able to recognize them. That to me sounds a lot more realistic and a lot more like the interpreting I'm used to than this idea that, it's just about your brain processing language. I've certainly had quite a few events where I've been interpreting, or my boothmate's been interpreting it, and you've had to not so much manage emotion as recognize that it's there and know how to deal with it. And there was one occasion that I use this story all the time where I noticed that the people I was interpreting for were beginning to get really frustrated and annoyed with each other. And the question as an interpreter then is, well, what do you do when you recognize that? But I guess if we're not teaching interpreters that it's their job to see those things and to deal with those things, that they might just go, well, if they get annoyed at each other, I don't care as long as I still get paid. The way that you're talking about interpreting seems to be a lot more emotionally intelligent and emotionally responsible as well.
That's how I imagine interpreting, and I think also now with technology becoming a big topic, as I said in the beginning, I think this emotional intelligence is something that will definitely distinguish humans from machines still for quite a while, and that's why I think we should attach importance to them, also for ourselves, because I think thinking about them and seeing ourselves as emotional creatures also helps us dealing with challenges. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are you thinking of things like I don't know, vicarious trauma or things like that when you mean dealing with stressful situations, or is that not something that you're looking into?
Well, just maybe on a very mild and simple level. I think if we don't see ourselves as computers, but as humans who have emotions and who may also be sometimes under the influence of their emotions, that's what makes emotions so fascinating. That we can sometimes not regulate them, and we cannot really master them, and they have power over us, a lot of power sometimes. But if we accept that, we may also, this idea of being a computer means you are working, you are functioning, you are performing, come what may. And if you don't, this is a failure. This is not how human beings function, and this is not how they are. And I think through thinking about emotions also comes maybe a little bit of a more human and softer way of dealing, and more adaptive way also of dealing with the way humans actually perform and the way they are made. Yeah.
Now, I'm glad you brought up the whole technology thing, but because I was a bit reluctant to bring it up. But it was one of the topics that you discussed during this radio panel that I mentioned earlier. So you said that these emotional skills, I guess, would still differentiate humans from machines, which is an interesting thought, because basically one thing I've taken away from this discussion is that we don't really know all that much about how emotions work and how emotions and interpreting interact and so on and so forth. But still, as humans, we seem to have an intuitive grasp. At least most people seem to be intuitively capable of sensing emotions, of being, showing empathy towards other people, and letting emotions influence how they interpret as well, is what you mentioned just a few minutes ago. So I guess the takeaway probably is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that even if we don't really understand the whole emotional side of interpreting, at least not to 100%, we can still know that it's the advantage we have over machines, because, some machines are now able to, I think, interpret facial expressions, but they still, it seems to me, they still don't get the whole picture of these different input channels, so the visual and the audio channel as well, because humans can hear, sometimes emotions just through auditory input. If I'm making any sense at all. Exactly.
Often emotions actually are decisive in the way the emotional content that you perceive is decisive in the way you interpret a message, and this is something that humans can do. As you say, you have this multimodal input actually in communication. It does not only happen through the verbal utterance, but it's a whole a picture of of nonverbal communication that is happening as well. And this machines can't do. And exactly, emotional competences. People have them to a different extent, but we all have them, and I'm sure interpreters also refine them through their job. And they can grasp things in communication through these skills, competences, or skills, or intelligence, whatever you emotional intelligence, whatever you may call it. They can grasp things that machines can't, but that are extremely important. We would not be able to communicate if we would not be able to interpret emotional information that comes with the language. Emotions are very, very important for us to be able to understand the full meaning of a conversation.
Couldn't agree more.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I also think it's a much wider perspective on language than you hear from the machine translation experts or the machine interpreting marketing people. That awareness that, human communication is not just the words that are spoken. I think it's the point that I think everyone came to agree on this discussion of whether humans would be replaced by machines, was the fact that we've not really scratched the surface on what is going on when you're making meaning. And even how is meaning made is a massively open question. Does your experimental work cause you to reflect on the emotions that you deal with as a researcher and even as a human being as well?
No, actually, I just think of the data. No. So as an experimenter, of course, you try to be as neutral as possible, which is difficult often, especially when you have very nice subjects. And they start talking to you, and you start talking to them, and you think, this is the wrong emotional direction. Yeah. So indeed, that's as soon as you are part of the experiment, of course, you also influence it, and you have to mention it and consider it also when you interpret or try to make sense of the data you find. But then you would, of course, try to set up experiments where your influence is minimized, so that people sit in front of a screen and the whole experiment actually happens through a computer program that is always the same, because it does not have emotions and does not interact. So that would be one idea. If you are interacting with the people, as I did, for example, when I did the study with the interpreters, then this is indeed an issue. And then, of course, and you probably know that when you're doing, as you've done research yourself, or as you're doing research, you know that when you do research, you go through a lot of emotions.
That's just called one supervision meeting.
Yeah, it's a very emotional process doing research. So but it's even then it may help to be aware of emotional competence, and maybe also sometimes just to know that it's normal. And that these emotions are normal, and that you just have to accept them and let them pass.
I must admit, it reminds me a lot of the episode that we did with Justine Mason on mental health.
Me too.
It's saying some of the same things, but from a different angle. She was very keen on the fact that we are not machines, we are humans. And that we need to not. So I don't know if you're aware, there's a history in interpreting of the neutral, invisible, almost aloof conduit. Yeah. And then people turn around and say, this is very strange. Why do conference interpreters, especially, they're the only ones who've dared to measure, why do they have such a high rate of emotional burnout?
Yep.
And you feel like saying, well, it's because you tried to make them into machines.
Yes.
Yep.
I know you probably didn't mean to, because very few researchers mean to do this, but it seems like your research is actually something that the profession need to think about and go, well, how far have we accepted the humanity of the interpreter? I know it's not your topic, but it'd be a question for interpreters. Do our current codes of conduct allow interpreters to be humans? Does our commitment to neutrality and perfect accuracy, is that realistic if we're going into emotional settings? Well, the answer is, from your research, probably not. Expecting an interpreter to perform at 100%. I heard from an interpreter once, who I think she said that in one day she told a family that their grandfather was dying, dealt with a childhood leukemia case and then a miscarriage back to back, and then wondered why she couldn't go to work the next day.
Yeah.
That's why it is important to raise awareness of emotions. Exactly that's the thing. I mean, for decades we have defined professionalism as being exactly that. You just perform, you function, whatever has happened to you. But that's just not how human beings are. And I think the more we become aware of this, I mean, we still need to, in professional work, we still need to expect a certain performance and a certain code of conduct and goals and so on. But the more the more emotions become something that we integrate into our way of seeing human beings and seeing professionals, the better we will understand such situations. And I'm perfectly aware of this debate from the past, but I think especially with respect to the future, where we have these machines as something we have to kind of have a dialogue with, or at least with the people who are interested in them and who build them and make them more intelligent and so on. The debate with respect to emotions will not only be do human beings have emotions, but why do their emotions make them irreplaceable or how do you say? Yeah, why do they make them so special?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so not emotions being something that actually prevents you from doing something, but emotions being the asset.
I love this because interpreters have been called special many, many times. But the meaning of the word special seems to change every time.
Well, that's not only true for interpreters. That's true for translators as well. That's also true for other people where in other domains, I think.
It makes me wonder whether if we were to look at dealing with emotions and managing emotions, whether there would be a difference between interpreters who are, because of their work in emotional situations every time they do their job, and translators who tend to work on their own. I'm not saying that translators don't feel emotion, but I just wonder if the way of dealing with emotional stimuli and the response to it and its effect might be different between certainly translators who've been doing their job for 25 years and interpreters who've been doing their job for 25 years.
I think that's one of the interesting things we could study, how our emotions, how are they different in the translation process and in the interpreting process. On the one hand, it seems to be obvious that interpreting may be more emotional because you have this direct conversation. The emotions of the conversation partners go through you, right? On the other hand, one observation that I had in the booth is that your job is so fast. You're so highly concentrated and you're so much trying to, it has to be so, so quick sometimes with the content that the question is how much space does the cognitive load leave actually for emotions? That could be another aspect, but this remains to be examined further.
And speaking of which, to sort of kind of slowly wrap up this, I wanted to know what's coming next for you, because you have, I think, described a few, I don't know what the phrase is in English, I think a few future avenues for future research. So I'm wondering what it means for you personally, Caroline. What are you, as far as I understand, you're still in the process of running the study or analyzing it? So what's next for you?
Basically analyzing it. Yeah. And to analyze it, I will have to, I will go back to London to my lab and discuss it with them, because statistics are not that easy for a language person.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So that's probably what I will do during the summer, and then we'll see what the data tell us, and what and if there are any interesting things to examine in more detail.
Right.
Or if we actually decide maybe emotions and interpreting should be studied differently, right? That's maybe we did not choose the right approach to studying it. That could also be a possibility. But so yeah, it very much depends on the data. But one thing I for this study on positive emotions and abstractness, the processing of abstract concepts. But one thing I absolutely want to work on further is to develop the training of emotional competences, targeted more to our professions, because there are already existing quite a lot of training programs that are really, really targeted to particular professions, and there may be also a few already, but I think we could maybe create synergies to raise awareness and to make these knowledge about these things more, knowledge about emotional intelligence, about emotional competences more available to interpreters and also to translators, and to increase their awareness, and maybe also to help them perform well in their job, and maybe also be happy. That would be also a good thing. And that's something I would very much like to work on, and we have already started to work on a concept here. Yeah, so that's something I will work on as well in the next month.
Well, it sounds like there's almost another follow-up episode in there. That sounds like a lot of material. But great.
I hope so. I will let you know.
Great. Well, it's been fantastic to talk to you, Caroline, and I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your your experience and your research, and also your enthusiasm for the topic today. So good luck with the rest of the study, of course.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for accepting me.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure for us.
Community.
Absolutely. So we hope that listeners will also find it as interesting as we did. I'm quite sure they will, actually. And this has been episode 24 of the Troublesome Terps. Now, just a few housekeeping remarks. Once again, if you want to join the conversation, if you want to get in touch with us, you can do so on our website, which is at troubleterps.com, where you can also leave comments for individual episodes. We're looking forward to that. And of course, you can find us on social media. On Twitter, we're at TroubleTerps, and we're also on Facebook, facebook.com/TroubleTerps. You can find our all podcast episodes on YouTube as well, if you're more of a visual person. You can listen to the beautiful audiograms that we upload there. And of course, our regular reminder that we have a live event coming up in November. And I hope by the time this episode is live, you will be able to buy tickets, if any tickets are still available, because the number is limited. More information about that can be found on our social media and also on troubleterps.com/live. And that's it for today. Have a good evening and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
So I was explaining on Twitter that I'm thinking of adding pirate to my interpreting languages, because I heard it would make a really good sea language.
But